Hi, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jared Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On today's episode, I'm talking to my friend, the novelist Jack Cheng. Jack and I met in New York about 5 years ago when we were both living there. Jack was running a digital product studio called Disrupto, and at the time was spending his nights and weekends working on what would become his first novel, These Days, which he eventually self-published on Kickstarter. Since that time, Jack has moved to Detroit and has transitioned to writing novels full time, and last month saw the release of his new book, See You in the Cosmos. In this episode, Jack and I talk about his transition from designing to writing, the similarities between designing products and writing fiction, and the power of reflecting on your creative practices. We recorded this episode before See You in the Cosmos was out, so I had not read it at the time, and we don't talk too much about the actual story, but the book has since released, and I just started reading it, and it's really, really wonderful story. I feel like I recommended his first book, These Days, to everyone I meet, so after you're done listening to this episode, I really recommend you pick up both These Days and his new book, See You in the Cosmos. A quick programming note before we get into it. I just want to say this is the 20th episode of Scratching the Surface, and I want to thank all of you for listening over the last few months. It's been so great to hear from so many of you, and I'm thrilled that it's really resonating. If you've been enjoying the podcast, I do have a quick favor. If you could rate it and leave a comment in iTunes, that would be great. It helps with findability in the iTunes store and helps get it out to more people. It takes just a few seconds, and I really appreciate all your support. And I have a few more great conversations coming up in the next few weeks that I can't wait for you to hear. But until then, thank you for listening, and let's get into today's episode. Here's my conversation with Jack Cheng. I was thinking about this conversation, having this conversation with you earlier today, and I realized, kind of like I was just saying, your career, my view of your career has been one that's kind of shifted between design and writing. And when we met, you were working as a designer, but I came to your work originally through your writing on your blog at the time. And this was, I think, like 2012 or so, probably. And so I was curious, for you, what came first in your life, design or writing?
I would say that design was a career for me before writing was a career. Um, but it's like if I trace it further back, when I was like really little, I would do I drew a lot and I would do a lot of art and and that was always something that not necessarily like not necessarily design, but even in high school, I would be like goofing around with like Photoshop in my spare time. I'd be like um I spent a lot of my like teenage years like entering those Photoshop contest websites. And so I think part of and
Yeah.
it was just like it was like photoshopping celebrity heads onto like Renaissance paintings and things like that. And so that but like I wouldn't have really considered that design, but that sort of paved the way for a career in design. It was like the kind of like my like Photoshop and illustration chops that landed me my first job in advertising as an like art direction
Oh,
intern.
interesting.
Um, and so that was, yeah, that was like something that was going on. And like in sort of meanwhile, um, I was always, um, I always did well at writing related things. In school, like, even if I didn't think even if I didn't realize that like you could have a career as a writer,
Mm-hmm.
I entered like short story competitions at school, and Um, and like I always, yeah, I always did well on like essays and term papers and things like that. Um, and even when I was in advertising, um, like how my sort of my like later years, and I didn't spend that much time in advertising in total. It was probably only like 3 to 4 years.
Hmm.
But like the later half of it, I became a copywriter in part because um, in advertising, you typically work in like two-person creative teams with an art director and a writer.
Right.
And it was in part because like my creative partner was already an art director, and so he was like like an extremely visual person, and and I was sort of more like the like I kind of like entered into that creative partnership, um, or I entered into that creative partnership and
Huh.
then ended up kind of being a writer by default because we needed a writer. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, so it's kind of I mean, I've definitely gone back and forth, uh, and I've never. Hmm, I guess like I guess it wasn't until I was doing more like web stuff and user interfaces that I actually considered myself a designer. Um, and it also like
Oh.
wasn't until I really started like working on these days on my first novel that I started considering myself a writer. And so
Hmm.
I always felt like I was kind of an outsider to both like writing and design in a way that like I was kind of this I wasn't
Yeah.
really like in deeply involved in like either community um until like and like I think that's different now in that like that I very much consider myself like a writer and specifically like a fiction writer and even more specifically a novelist and I think
Yeah.
that like that's something that um yeah, it was kind of this process of not even a process. It was kind of just like both of those things were coexistent in my life for a while. Uh, and and there are definitely like ways that you can kind of like frame what I do right now, even as writing fiction as I think as like design and sort of the bigger sense of the word.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that that's kind of two of the questions that you started to answer the next two questions that I had, and one was I've interviewed, kind of the overarching theme of this podcast is the relationship between criticism and practice, or between theory and making.
Hmm.
But one of the sub themes that I've started seeing emerge is the relationship between design and writing. And I've interviewed a lot of people who actually have said something very similar to what you just said about feeling, either like they weren't fully a part of design when they were a designer, but then they started writing, and like that's actually a thing that's come up before in some of these interviews. But the thing that I was thinking about is that I've not talked to anyone who writes fiction, and I actually think that there are a lot of similarities between fiction writing and the design process. And so I was curious, do you think I was curious, I guess this is a two-part question. What relationships do you see between writing fiction and designing? And then also, does someone like yourself that has a background in both, do you think that brings things to the table that you otherwise might not have had if you didn't have that design background?
Hmm. Um, so I guess like to tackle the first question, uh, with regard to fiction, I've actually like joked to a few people that like I've gone from designing product technologies to designing thought technologies. Um, and and sort of like an example of what I mean by that is like um, this summer I was in Japan for a couple of weeks with one of my very best friends, and we were hiking on this like mountain trail, and it was like pouring rain out, and and so we're like we have like our kind of like raincoats on, and we're just like
Mhm.
trekking along on this trail. And I go to like put my hood on because it's raining, so I put my like waterproof hood on. And I
Yeah.
remember like when I did that, uh, it was like the hood blocked out the sound of of my environment, and so I felt
Mm.
very much like it was disconnecting me from like my immediate environment, and like I wanted the experience of the rain, and the sound and the fullness of
Yeah.
that sound without you know without like basically having to get wet. And so as like
Huh.
as someone who thinks about like products and product design, I was like, oh, someone should invent like a rain hood that has like like mesh where the ears are, so that it's like you still get the sound without getting wet.
Yeah.
But then like I thought about that some more, and I was like, actually, if you look at it's like if you look at uh, the local people, or like people who live in mountainous areas, right? A lot of times, like I've been on other treks with you know with like people in a local town in South America, where they're just like walking around without an umbrella. It's raining and they just don't have an umbrella, right? And and
Right.
that like
Right.
that 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 the idea of a rain jacket with like breathable ears, I guess. Um, it's like that's one invention, and that's one solution. Another like another design solution, or maybe like maybe it actually feels weird to call it a design solution, but another way around this issue of like being bothered by the rain is to like have a set of cultural values where you're not bothered by the rain. And
Mm.
and I think that like that's something that I find that like with fiction, um, like so much of fiction is getting like like so much of the benefit of reading fiction is is being able to place yourself in someone else's shoes, and not only like place yourself within
Mhm.
someone else's shoes, but do so in a way where you're kind of like absorbing their cultural values. And it's often like, and that's often connected to like the values of the author. And that's something that like,
Yeah.
that I think that, when I talk about like designing, like, yeah, designing thought technologies, um, it's very much like, I think like I'm approaching, I approach writing fiction as like kind of my own inquiry into my values, and trying to like
Mm.
articulate and find out like what I believe is like good and right, through through having these
Mhm.
characters like play out these scenarios on the page. And I guess like for me, that's something that, and the reason that I moved from design into writing was that that's something that like I don't think is as common with a design practice, that like um, or at least like when you're designing for clients. Um, I think like it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like you go into those design scenarios more with more tasked to solve a problem, than you are like to task to
Yeah.
like actually question the values that create that problem.
Yeah. Yeah, that's something I've been thinking about a lot too, because I feel like I don't even know exactly how to phrase it, but I agree with you that I feel like I think that the term problem solving in design has actually been problematic for design,
Uh-huh.
because you go in with it immediately sets up how your process is going to work. And it's, here's the thing that's wrong, here's the thing that needs to be fixed, here's a goal, what are the steps we need to do to solve it? Where I think design could have that inquiry to it, where it's like, let's dig, let's excavate what's here and figure out, the best way to show this thing, tell this story, make this product. Where it could be almost a type of storytelling, but it's defined too early, where it's, this needs to be an app, this needs to be a poster, this needs to be a book, and then it's all about solving for that. Um, I don't know. I mean, that's been a lot of my experience. I feel like that's kind of why I went back to school, because I felt like that was wrong, or maybe not even wrong, but limiting in a lot of ways. But this connected something for me that I was thinking about when I was thinking about your work, and when I first met you, and a lot of your writing was about design, product design, digital design. What is it like to work on the web? And I'm wondering now, were you kind of writing those pieces? And the two that I'm thinking of specifically were your piece, The Slow Web. And you did one, and I can't remember what it's called, and I was actually Googling for it earlier today, and I couldn't find it, but you were using the analogy of keyframes in interaction design. And I'm wondering if that writing came out of a place for you about what you ended up finding fulfillment in your fiction, and it was you trying to articulate and figure out design processes, or the role of design, or your role as a designer.
Mm-hmm.
Does
I
that make sense?
Yeah, I think they're um I think they came out of a place um of just trying to like I guess just trying to like understand myself. Um and it was like less the, because I didn't really think of myself as really a designer. It was like less about
Mm,
like my role as a designer, and it was more just like so the keyframe thing was just it was just like that one was more, I guess, about just uh kind of this like idea that I had, or this thing that I realized
yeah.
that like, that we tend to like think in keyframes, and we um like wait,
Hmm.
was
That's
that
right.
it was I was like
Yeah.
likening it to cartoons,
Yeah. Yeah. That's it.
and that like that sort of, if you think about video editing, right, the things that get pulled out are keyframes, are like the moments when things change. And I was saying, and I
Mm,
guess like that blog post was kind of just about how it's like we were biased to notice those changes rather than like all the stuff that leads up to them.
right.
Um, and
Right. That's it. That's the one I was thinking of.
yeah, so I think that was more of just the case of like, oh, me like noticing like something interesting that I thought was interesting, and then wanting to share
Mm,
that. Um, the slow web thing very much came out of just a frustration I was having with, with social media and with like all these apps and notifications on my phone, and I was trying to
Hmm.
identify like apps and services that I felt didn't make me feel like that didn't make me feel like I was addicted to something. Um, and and yeah, it's interesting because with that post in particular, people still link to that, like, and it's been like 3 4 years or like maybe
Oh,
longer
wow.
since I wrote that. um and I actually recently put up like a little paragraph that was like kind of like an update, like, here's where I am on like the thinking around this now. um but
Oh, wow.
basically, like, I think when I first wrote that essay, I was trying to extract a set of like user experience principles that sort of govern these, like, these apps that I felt like were delivered this more like
Hmm.
sane and more like, you know calmer experience. um but like, I think where I've sort of like evolved on that and it gets back to this question of values, is that, like, if you're trying to like change the way that, like, these apps interact with us, and change our relationship to consuming information. You can't do that solely on like the interface level.
Right.
It's like, because there's this whole set of like uh, there's this whole system and set of incentives in like the way that startup companies are funded, and the way that their like success is evaluated, that is all about like, like is all about getting
Right.
people addicted, and all about getting people to use the app as like much as possible. And so you can't,
Hmm.
like, I feel like without like questioning those values of like, yeah, without questioning the values that drive um, these apps and, you know these technologies to do what they do, then you can't actually, I don't think you can actually, have any real change. And you can, yeah, I don't think you can actually, like, separate those two, and try to treat them as like unrelated things.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that's something that I feel like as I hadn't totally. I should actually go back and reread. I should have reread that before I talked to you, but a lot of the things that I've been talking to people about, and something that's emerged through a lot of these conversations that I've had, is that design criticism, or the discussion that I think designers should be having around their work, should not be limited to aesthetics, typography, colors, layout. When a company redesigns its logo, everybody tweets about it, but should kind of be a deeper discussion around the economics of this thing, the culture that this object comes from, the politics behind it, the business that it comes from, because that all affects how the design was made, and then how a piece of design is put out into the world. And I think that's what you were getting at in the slow web also. And I don't mean to kind of have you talking about a piece that you wrote 5 years ago that you don't, maybe kind of fully agree with. But I do think that you were on to that type of discussion around these things.
Yeah, and I guess, like, one question that I might have for you in that regard is like what are, where are the places that you actually go to talk with other designers about those things?
That's a great question. That, I mean, I
Right?
feel
It's
like
like, do you
that's the
meet
other
monthly
question
at
that I'm
like
asking myself a
AIGA
lot
and
is,
Right. Right. Like where does a conversation like that? Because I think, and this is even kind of related to what you were saying earlier about values. Is, to me, that's very important to those type of things are very important to the work that I take on, and the jobs that I take and the work that I do, and I just feel like they're not. And I feel like a lot of people agree with that and have those same interests, but there's no place for that type of discussion, because media and technology is moving so fast that it's kind of the hot take is the easy discussion to have about, when Facebook redesigns newsfeed, instead of asking why was it redesigned and what is this optimized for, or and all of these questions. So I don't know. That's a great question that I haven't figured out an answer to. Something else that I was thinking about, though, that's kind of related to that is your first book these days is a novel and is fiction, but I actually thought that it kind of wrestled with a lot of these questions also, and that there was a certain kind of cultural and technology, I don't know the word, commentary, or you were asking questions about the roles of these things in our lives in that book. And the main character was a designer. Were these all conscious questions that you were asking yourself that at the time that found their way into the book, or was that kind of an unconscious part of your process?
Yeah, it was definitely. I think those questions were unconscious, and
Mm.
my writing the book was kind of like my way of trying to make them more conscious, at least like to myself.
Yeah.
That book actually started with around the time that um, that I had started my company, that I had started Disrupto in New York.
Oh,
Um,
right.
or it was sort of, I remember it was the time when my co-founders and I were still like, it's like the very first project we worked on as a team together was Steepster, the my tea website.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
so that was sort of, we worked on that as a just like as like a trial project to see how well we would work together. And
Mm.
so it was, I actually started working on these days as I was like journaling. Around the same time we started working on Steepster. I was doing this like daily journaling practice, and uh, and
Right.
then like one day, I like had nothing to write, and like a scene popped out. And then like the next day I wrote down another scene. And so after a few weeks I was like, oh, this is like, this like could be a book. Um, and so I
Oh,
think like
interesting.
the existence of that practice was something it ended up being a place for me to sort of reflect about the things that I was struggling with in like my day-to-day work and life experience. Um, and
Hmm.
sort of, this like, yeah, this question of like, oh, um, are these devices that are supposed to help us communicate actually getting in the way? Are they actually getting in the way of our communication? Um,
Right.
and and yeah, and it's like they're like, yeah, a lot of those are like questions that don't have really neat answers, and that you can't just, the answer isn't just to like, yeah, to like design something, or to like um or to like design a product, or to write a think piece and just be done with it. They're kind of like,
Right.
yeah. And like I don't know
Do you
if I
do,
actually I don't know if I actually like came to a conclusion about it in the book these days. I think like
yeah.
a lot of it was just like left very open, and it was sort of like, I think that book sort of ends on this note of like, is this just like
Mm.
what's going to keep happening? Um,
Yeah. Yeah, it was a. I remember finishing the book and it feeling darker than I was expecting.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I if I had to write
Do-
that ending again, I'd probably like be a little gentler on the characters and handle it in a different way. But
yeah.
that's it's my first novel, so I'm learning. I'm
Right.
learning.
Well,
Well, that was a question that I had that I wanted to ask you about. This is again, I'm sorry that all my questions are kind of these multi-part questions, but I was I was curious if that kind of idea of you wrestling with these questions kind of in the world that you're in, is that how, I don't know how to phrase this exactly. Is that kind of core to who you are as a fiction writer? And the reason that I ask that is I have not, obviously have not read the next book, which comes out in a couple of weeks, but sounds like it's very different than these days. Do you tackle some of these types of cultural questions in the new book?
Um, I Yeah, yeah, on some level. And I think like part of it was that, when I'm tackling these questions, I don't like always realize I'm tackling these questions. They're just kind of
mm,
like, the it's like to me, like when I'm writing fiction, it's almost like I'm entering into this dream. And like, in that in the dream world, like things will just like appear and you don't really like it's like I don't really know like what they mean until like after like I've laid down the words, and then I sort of like go back and try to like figure out what they mean. It's like, why is this character appearing, or like why does this thing keep coming up in my stories? They're sort of a
yeah.
way of um uh like an analogy I've used is that like it's like imagine like you're like you're like pouring yourself into this like, imagine that like you're like this liquid form and you're pouring yourself into this new vessel. Every novel is like a different shaped jar. um and
Mm,
that like with, when it's in this like new container, you can actually like examine it, and you can like, see, you might see things that you might not otherwise see. um and I think like it's a way of yeah, it's a way of like taking all those like dormant subconscious things and like just like putting them out in the open so that you can then like I think like then go back and like psychoanalyze them, or like try to figure out what they mean. Um, I
right.
will say that like I'm becoming more and more conscious of the things that I'm wrestling with, and so for this next book that I'm going to be working on after See You in the Cosmos comes out, and I like it's like
Oh wow.
I've already like started like sketching it out. But that's something, it's like for that book, it's like, uh, my own experience as in this country as an Asian American is something that like
Mm,
I have sort of like stayed away from trying to examine for a long, long time. And I think I'm just like coming
mm,
around to trying to understand more of like that part of my identity, like my identity as an Asian American. And so that
yeah.
so I would say like this next book is a case of like, I'm entering into it with like a subject of examination, and that like that, part of the reason that like I'm embarking on this project is because I want to know better like that side of myself. um and yeah.
That's, yeah, that's really interesting. Were you able to do that kind of self examination, or kind of ask those types of questions when you were a designer or when you had your own, kind of product shop? Were those types of things at all connected to the design work you were doing?
No, they were not. I think part of that is because um, you kind of like it's hard, at least for me, it's hard to do that when you're like also like running a business and trying to work with other people, that like
Right.
that those kinds of endeavors are the endeavors of art, and that like
Mm-hmm.
there are yeah there are like too many things, there were like too many other things going on that I was just trying to like basically like just trying to stay sane and trying to like just kind of like I think there's this tendency um with kind of the rhythms of um you know product design and like designing for the web, where you just there's not as much time for like planning and setting intentions, um or like setting like
Mm-hmm.
bigger intentions, where you kind of just like move from project to project. um
Yeah.
One thing that I found really satisfying about like writing novels is that like I that the format itself, um I think the format itself, where you're working on these like multi-year projects in waves, right? You have kind of like a first draft that'll take you
Mm.
like however many months, and then like after you
Right.
get that draft done, it goes in a drawer, or it goes into a folder, and you like take some time away from it, and so you get this chance for like actual like long-term involvement in something. And I think that's like a component um that really like it's it makes you step back and think about the bigger picture. And that's something that like I never
Yeah.
found in like in sort of my design work or like my advertising work, like other than like I would
Mm-hmm.
say like other than like redesigning my own website, where like
Right.
because you never revisit, you rarely at least I in my case, like I rarely like revisited a project, um because we were doing a lot of like client work, so we kind of had these like one-offs and one-off projects, and or that like that there wasn't this like even on the flip side, when you're sort of like doing something that's more along the lines of a startup, that you're just like you're in the same thing like
Yeah.
day after day for like years on end, and
Right.
there's like less a like you're sort of like pressured against taking time to like step back and really like let things ferment, and let things kind of like
Yeah.
um yeah.
Yeah, that's been something I've been thinking about a lot, and I think it's just because that I am in grad school right now, and so I've had the time where I can kind of really think about the work that I'm doing, and I've been looking back over a lot of looking back at my career and the jobs I had before I came back to school, and I've noticed, and I can't tell if this is a bit of kind of revisionist history on my end, but I've noticed that there are certain intellectual questions or certain themes that emerge from projects that I've worked on that I'm really proud of. There are certain, it's a lot of them have me asking particular questions in them that don't always manifest themselves in the finished product, but I remember thinking about them. And I can't tell if that's me, if that's me coming from this kind of privileged place in design where I can kind of insert some of myself in that, and how feasible that is economically for, across all of design. And so that's why I asked that for you, is if that was something that you really only were able to get out of when you started writing.
One thing that kind of like brings to mind is that uh, like so I've had a meditation practice for probably like 4 or 5 years now. Um,
Mm.
and I think that that's like um, the that's really informed the way that I think um, about like uh, the relationship between uh, like between a daily practice and also like involvement in, and also like kind of like uh, having like retreats to sort of like step back and get perspective, and also just
Mm.
involvement
Hmm.
with like a community of practitioners. um in that like
Right.
it's sort of like, yeah, that like those three things work together, where you have something that you like do every day, and you have um kind of like you have that daily practice, and then you have these like more rare more intermittent retreats where like that is like my friend in San Francisco. She and some of her friends do like a quarterly like life planning summit or something like that.
Oh,
um
yeah.
and so they're like these like you have, and like we do that in, we did that in, like we do that in the design community as well, right? We have these like conferences, like like Brooklyn Beta was like, or like XOXO. They're these events
Right.
that you go there and like you get really inspired, and you're able to like reflect on your practice and on the things that you do. um and then
Mm.
like in between those two extremes, I think, and what piece that often gets like overlooked is um, this like regular like physical community where you can actually get together to talk about both those things, to talk about kind of like the bigger intentions that you
Yeah.
get from like retreat or conference, and to like then like connect connect that line, connect that with your daily practice. And I think like those when I was in New York still, I would go to like this meditation center every Tuesday night, and then like we'd sit as like a group and meditate, and then afterwards whoever the instructor was would give a talk. And I found that though those were like really they really uh, help like cultivate this like habit, cultivate that the kind of like habits that
Yeah.
that led to a healthier daily practice. And that like or like I'd go do like a meditation retreat, and then like it's like after that retreat it's those weekly gatherings that were kind of like maintenance on my practice.
Hmm. Hmm.
um and to sort of like jump back to like the kind of like slow web thing, like one thing that I've sort of like am like starting to do here in Detroit is like talk to people about maybe having like a regular meetup where once a month we just
Mm.
like talk about the kind of like the role of like these technologies and social media in our life, and like how they've impacted our
Right.
day-to-day life, uh, and like maybe some things we can try for like the next month to sort of better manage those habits. um, And so I
That's a
think
great
like,
idea.
it's, yeah, it's like I would say that, like, it's like if you're, looking for, uh if you're looking for other people in like the design community to who are all interested in more like, questioning the kind of like values that go into the work that you do, and like in
Right.
more, it's like you could start in like a lot, and in worse places than like just having like a monthly like gathering of human beings to
Yeah.
like talk about it.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really great idea. I have just one kind of last question for you, or one last thing that I was interested in talking with you about, and it is your Sunday letter, your Sunday newsletter that started. It's funny. I was thinking about it. It started from your Kickstarter. It was your Kickstarter updates for the book, and I never read the Kickstarter updates for the Kickstarters that I back, but yours were actually like very interesting and really gave a lot of insight into what it took for you to write this book, to get it printed, to edit it, to designing the cover. And then it's this thing that you've continued doing. And now it's evolved into this podcast, which is, the process of you publishing your new book. And so it seems like as you've been working on these two books, you've had this habit of this kind of almost meta look at what you are writing and what your creative process is like. And I'm curious if that act of writing every week and reflecting back on the work that you're doing, has that had any influence on the actual, when you sit down to write, and your actual creative process, that kind of weekly thinking about it and sharing that?
Sometimes it comes to mind that, or sometimes I'll be like working on something and I'll be like, oh, this is like a good thing for like, the Sunday letter. um More often than not,
Mm.
it's more just like, it's like, 6 p.m. on Sunday night, and I'm like, oh shoot, I need to like I need to write this letter. And so
Yeah.
like often it ends up just being this like sort of like very like strained and like forced kind of like reflection. And like sometimes that's like what I need. um and so so it's not, I don't think about it much. There were like, what I guess like with the podcast, it might be a little, it was a little different because um like I had the idea to do the podcast for quite some time, for like, while I was still actually like finishing the book. I was thinking like, oh,
Mm.
it'd be cool to do a podcast, but at the same time, it was just like, yeah, like it's also just, one step at a time. Like it's like, first let's like actually finish this book, and then we can think about like everything else.
Right.
um
Right.
yeah, I definitely like, I'd like it to be more of this like considered reflection. um but I think like, I think what usually happens is that like the reflection, like, I think what usually happens is that like Monday is the day for like reflection about the Sunday letter. That like, there's this kind of like
Mm.
natural, like anytime we like finish something and like send it out in the world, then like we actually get to stop and think about it. Um
Right.
and yeah, so I don't, there it's, I think the other thing is that, with the podcast especially, is that it's also, because I'm interviewing like the different people, um, involved in making the book, like my agent and my editors, and like I think what makes the podcast different is that like it's more of this like mutual reflection on, you know, something that you worked on together. um and like, and I think that is more of like, that ends up being more of a kind of like moment to express like gratitude and kind of like appreciate what you guys have been through, what you've been through with, you know, with someone, and to kind of just step back and say, oh, you know, like this thing that is like just constantly in motion, like, yeah, we're a part of this, and we're, you know,
Right.
it's really like amazing to kind of like be a part of this.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's really interesting. Thank you so much. That was kind of how I was wanting to end it. So thank you so much for talking with me and for kind of being a part of my project. And I can't wait. I've loved the podcast, and I cannot wait to read the new book.
Mm. Yeah, I can't wait for you to read it. And I will just say that like um, it's been, you know, because we met when I think you had just moved to New York. Um,
Yeah.
and it's been really like really amazing to sort of like follow your career from like, you know, from Warby Parker to like Facebook, and now like, you know, you're doing
Right.
you're like
Yeah.
getting your graduate degree and like doing this podcast and diving deeper into like criticism. I think it's awesome.
Oh, thanks. That really really means a lot. I really appreciate that. This episode was recorded on February 6th, 2017. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter at Surface Podcast. You can find us on iTunes and SoundCloud and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.